Okay, so you're ready to study about South Asia. South Asia is a realm that has waxed and waned. Certainly, it's important historically because several civilizations got their start in South Asia. Several major world religions got their start in South Asia. But despite its early prominence and importance, it kind of languished. In fact, your book, the introduction to this chapter, is actually quite nice in that it mentions that by the late 19th century, South Asia had become remote from the affairs of the world, hungry, weak, exploited, the prototype realm of the global periphery. Even after independence in 1947, India, as well as the other countries of South Asia, long remained among the world's poorest. For decades, population growth outstripped economic expansion. That kind of sets the kind of a dismal picture, but it also helps for you to keep that in mind when you now think about the modern turn that South Asia appears to have made. It seems to be making turning the corner where population, which at one time was considered a disadvantage, could be an advantage. So keep that in mind. Think about what South Asia might look like over the next 50 years and how its importance will change on the geopolitical stage. Okay, South Asia, perhaps more than any other region that we'll study in this book, is really defined by its geography. It's kind of hemmed in by oceans. It's got the Bay of Bengal, it's got the Indian Ocean. It's also, of course, hemmed in to the north, to the west, and to the east by mountains. And so it's geographically defined and it's culturally diverse in this relatively small area. South Asia is a relatively small region. It's very, very populous, so therefore it's got a very high population density, and that population is quite diverse. You've got several different religions at play and various forms of government in the different countries. So a lot of diversity in this very high density population region. So how did today's geography come to be? Well, of course, the globe was not always the way we currently picture it. Notice in this tectonic evolution graphic, you see where India, the Indian subcontinent, which one time was essentially an island, 71 million years ago, about the time when the dinosaurs went extinct, was out in the Indian Ocean, and it has since moved northward, slamming into the South Asian plate. And when you have continental crust, which is what the Indian island is, and of course the South Asian plate crust, which is also continental, when those crash into each other, there's nowhere to go but up, and therefore you have the Himalaya mountains forming. Okay, with the very interesting geography and topography produced by the Himalaya mountains comes some very interesting meteorology. India is home to, of course, the monsoon, these annual rains. India goes through long periods of no rain and then periods of rain every day, torrential downpours at times. And that's all due to the fact that you have moist air flowing in off the Bay of Bengal and as well as off the Arabian Sea and running into mountains. And of course, as moist air is forced upward, it cools. And when moist air cools, the water vapor, the gas form of water inside the air, condenses into cloud droplets, and you wind up with rain on the windward side of the mountains. Usually on the leeward side, you wind up with essentially a rain shadow, which we talked about before. So this ample flow of moist air occurs over periods of weeks or months, and that is called the monsoon season, when you have a lot of rainfall. And that's what especially Indians who make their living farming, the agricultural sector, depends upon this yearly refreshing of the land due to the monsoon rains. This is a neat slideshow, or it's actually an animation, which has some slideshows embedded in it. But it also gives you the chance to better understand the Indian monsoon and it's changed so dramatically from one season to the next, from the dry season to the wet season, and vice versa. Okay, so since the topography, since the geography really does define this region, let's take a little closer look at the mountains, at the topography. So you have out to the north and west what's the Hindu Kush region, which is actually in mostly Afghanistan. You have the Karakoram Range in that disputed region called Kashmir. You have essentially the Himalayas smack dab here in the middle. In fact, here's Mount Everest located there. Um, then, of course, you have the mountainous ranges in Bhutan and the Arunachal Pradesh in the east. In addition to the mountains, you should notice all these blues, right? All these rivers. Where do the rivers come from? What feeds the rivers? Well, as we described, the monsoon rains certainly feed the rivers, but that's not the only water source. Remember that all this mountainous terrain is really, really cold, and so you have mountains and glaciers, and it's the meltwater from those mountains that feed a lot of these rivers as well. So in addition to the mountains in the north, west, and east, you also have a few mountains, not quite as high, but what are called the Ghats here in the western part of the Indian Peninsula. But other than that, most of the land is relatively flat. That's why you have what's called the Deccan Plateau, which does indeed slope from west to east. So therefore, the rivers that are in the Deccan Plateau tend to flow toward the Bay of Bengal. The Indian or the South Asian or early civilization was actually called Sindhu, which is still seen in the Indus River and in the name of the country India. And this is one of several civilizations in the Bronze Age. They mentioned the Mesopotamian, which was sometimes also called the Fertile Crescent, of course the Indus Valley civilization, and of course the Egyptian civilization in the Nile. All were going on at essentially the same time, which is very interesting. Now, the Indus Valley civilization came and went, and it declined due to environmental change for the most part. These were agrarian societies that depended upon agriculture, and a few bad years or a change in the climate could essentially bring that civilization to its knees. And if you're interested in this sort of a topic, I encourage you to look up. There's plenty of books that detail how civilizations have come and gone. And sometimes it's been due to disease, but more often it's been due to climate-triggered famines. And one book that leaps to mind is called The Weather Makers by Tim Flannery. So if you're looking for that kind of reading, that's one title. And it's worth bearing in mind. Remember, we just mentioned about the fact that global climate change is affecting the snowpack in the Himalayas, from which all these rivers depend, all that flow depends. And of course, agriculture depends upon the flow of those rivers. So it's worth thinking about the fact that climate has impacted civilization in the past and can impact our civilization as time goes on. Nothing is permanent in this world, and so as the Indus Valley civilization declined, it peaked in about 2500 BC and then declined. There was a rise in the civilization in the Ganges Valley as well as in northern India, and that was partly due to the fact that Aryans, folks of Indo-European descent, moved into that region. Another byproduct of the Aryans settling in northern India is Hinduism. Hinduism derives from Vedism, which was the original religious belief. And one of the downsides of this religious belief system is social stratification. The fact that inherent in the belief system is essentially a caste system. And the caste system was the kind of social structure, the social order for many centuries. Now, as modern India modernizes and urbanizes, the caste system is going away, especially in urban areas. But in more rural areas, the caste system is still a justification for social inequity. One thing that's very interesting is that while Hinduism essentially spread through all of India, the language, the Aryan languages, the Indo-European languages, didn't make headway in the southern part of the Indian Peninsula, where there's more indigenous languages spoken. While Hinduism is the dominant religion in India, it's not the only game in town. Buddhism actually originated in India, and despite the fact that it's relatively there's a very relatively small population that practices Buddhism in India, it is a more prominent religion in other locations. So it did spread beyond India, even though its birthplace is in India. There's Jainism, there's Sikhism, and of course Islam in general. There are Muslims in India as well that make up a significant part of the population. Section about how Islam arrived on the scene in the late 10th century, and what's also very interesting, this is the closing paragraph of that section. It says, "It is remarkable that Islam never achieved proportional dominance over the realm as a whole. Whereas Pakistan is more than 96% Muslim and Bangladesh 91%, India, where the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire were centered, remains only about 15% Muslim today. Islam may have arrived like a giant tide, but Hinduism stayed afloat and outlasted the invasion." Of course, the next big invasion were the Europeans. The British, in the guise or in the form of the East India Company, arrived in the middle of the 18th century, which started the colonial period. We've already read about colonialism with regard to South America and the Caribbean, as well as in Africa. And the recurring theme is that quite often local resources are exploited. And in the case of South Asia, one thing that is mentioned is that, of course, Britain at the time of the colonial period in the mid-18th century was also undergoing an industrial revolution. That's where the industrial revolution took hold in England. And they had textile mills, and they needed more raw materials to produce cloth, to produce fabric. And so they started to encourage the farming of cotton in India. Now, one of the plus sides, upsides of the colonial transformation of South Asia was the extensive transport network. They needed to be able to get all this raw material, all these agricultural goods, to the coast to ship back to India and other parts of the world. And so an extensive transport network was set up by the British and the other colonizers, which is still in use today. As the colonial period came to an end and independence was established across South Asia, again, just like we've seen in Africa, just as we've seen in South America, sometimes very arbitrary boundaries were drawn, and that has continued to result in tensions among different religious groups and cultural groups. What had been British India was partitioned into India as well as then the Muslim states of Pakistan and what was at one time called East Pakistan, West Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan is now modern-day Bangladesh, so therefore West Pakistan is just Pakistan. But what you see in these two maps is the 1931 distribution of Muslims in this region compared to the 1951 distribution. What you see is, by checking out these colors, the state of Rajasthan and the Punjab of India, notice, became much, much less Muslim. Those Muslims essentially, was an exodus. They left India, where to the Muslim state of Pakistan. Similarly, in the state of West Bengal in India, there was an exodus of Muslims to the Muslim state of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. In a similar way, Hindus that were in those locations, that were in these now newly Muslim countries, there was an exodus. The question is, was it a forced exodus? Was it voluntary? Well, quite often, even if you're not being forced to move from one location to another, sometimes the social pressures of living as a minority in a new majority location are too much, and so it becomes a voluntary migration, but a necessary migration for many people. Now, it should be stressed at this point that India, modern day India, is a secular nation, just like America is a secular nation. So therefore there is no state religion. despite the fact that the Hindus are in the majority in India, it is not a Hindu nation. In fact, it's got a very significant Muslim population. It's the world's largest cultural minority. And by the structure of it's a democratic government, much like in America, which means that everyone has a say, no matter what your religion or no religion. Everyone should have a say in the government, and the government cannot establish one particular religion as a state religion. So it becomes very ticklish then for, as India becomes a bigger player on the world stage, the geopolitics of the U.S. dealing with India as well as the U.S. dealing with Pakistan, and the fact that both of these are nuclear powers becomes very, very complicated, which discusses the geopolitics of Kashmir, the fact that you've got a region that is majority Muslim and yet it's under Indian rule. Of course, the book does a nice job of discussing terrorism in this modern age of terrorism. It's interesting to read about this group called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is translated as the Party of the Righteous. And this is unfortunately one of the problems with religious certainty, is that groups think that they're absolutely right and should be turning that religious certainty into civil authority. They should be able to have their beliefs and their religious laws govern everyone. And that becomes a real problem. That does lead to, that mindset leads to terrorism. India is no stranger to terror. In addition to the territorial disputes with Pakistan, India also has some territorial beefs with China. And this becomes more complicated as the two countries become more intertwined through economics. As India and China become more economically interdependent, where China is realizing that India can be a very good market for them to sell their goods, this relationship, of course, is concerning to the United States, and so the United States is trying to figure out how to be involved with these other two emerging markets. South Asia has gone from being a backwater, an economic backwater, to being a potentially huge market for not only the US but also for China. And that's because of the economic growth that's going on and the fact that there is a middle class now developing in India. And of course, when you consider the population of India, this means that there's a lot of people with disposable incomes who can purchase products. So the globalization, the modernization has resulted in staggering growth for India. The problem is there's still a lot of disparity between rich and poor, and not even education all around. There's still a lot of people who are illiterate, people who are living in poverty. So the benefits of economic growth are not necessarily spread around. The staggering growth in South Asia is reflected in these little bar charts, which indicate the GNI, the gross national income per capita, that means per person, between 1990 and 2011. You can see that every country in South Asia has shown significant growth in the past 2 decades. Despite the modernization of South Asia, many people continue to rely on agriculture as their means of living. And what's very interesting is that the overall productivity, despite the numbers of people who are involved in agriculture, the overall productivity is low, in the sense that the contribution of agriculture to the national economy is only around 20%, despite the fact that a significantly larger part of the population in many of these countries is involved in agriculture. You see a nice graph here showing the population distribution. And one thing that's interesting is that there's a much greater distribution, apart from some of the mountainous terrain in the western and northern parts of South Asia, the population is pretty well distributed compared to some of the other regions we have studied, where most of the population is along the coast or along rivers or outside of desert areas. We see a large distribution of people in South Asia, and a large raw population for a relatively small geographic region, which means the density is pretty large. And that used to be considered a reason why economists thought that South Asia would never get out of its economic doldrums because it had just too many people. That's not necessarily the problem. As is pointed out in the book, not all high-density countries are struggling. If you take a country like Japan, which has a large population density and yet has a very high standard of living, and it's not because it is full of natural resources. They need to import a lot of the resources. However, they've got a lot of human resources. They've got a very educated population with a lot of skills, a lot of manufacturing. They can use what natural resources they do have and whichever ones they can import, and they can use them efficiently. And this is the upside to South Asia, is the fact that the productivity is on the rise. And when you've got a large population that's also very productive, you're going to become an economic power. The section on the demographic transition is relatively interesting. It used to be, of course, that people had more children, quite often because there was a high rate of infant mortality. And so you would have a large birth rate and large death rate, and your population would essentially remain the same in this stage 1 type of population. In more modern times, as modern medicine has decreased the death rate and allowed people to live longer, if you maintain the same birth rate, you have a population expansion. And that sometimes becomes a problem if your population becomes very, very large and you don't have very much productivity. That's going to mire your country in poverty. And the key is to reduce the birth rate. Giving women access to contraception allows the birth rate to fall, which allows the population to stabilize. These population pyramids are also interesting to analyze, especially as we look at the real powers in Asia, India, and China. One thing you can pick out from the Chinese population pyramid is the one-child rule that has now produced a very large population, relatively large population that are currently in their 40s and into their 50s, but a relatively small population at the base of the pyramid. And this will become a problem over time. Notice the projected by 2039, you're going to have a large population that are essentially going to be elderly and need to be supported by the working base, which is smaller than the top of the pyramid. India is perhaps better positioned in the sense that they're going to have enough of a working class base or working age base to support the older population. One problem comes into this part of the graph because you've got a cultural preference for male children, which has meant that there's going to be essentially not enough women for all the men in the population. So at the beginning of these notes, I encourage you to think about what South Asia is going to look like in 50 years, in 100 years, because it really is a key region in the world politically in the short term, because you have nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, who have a very, very tense relationship that could have devastating consequences. Economically, India has a large upside as long as its democratic and secular government can remain in place, as long as the birth rate continues to fall, as long as the education levels continue to rise in India. Economically, the sky appears to be the limit. Compare the population density map and the physiographic map of South Asia. What specific physiographic feature do people cluster around and why? How are these clusters related to agricultural activities? Also, Both India and Pakistan claim parts of Kashmir. Explain how each could argue their claim. Since China also claims part of Kashmir, how could these claims cause international strife? Here's another question for you. How did British colonialism change India? And finally, today the population ratio is very skewed in India. Why is it skewed, and could this impact India's future? Okay, so the first country in South Asia we're going to look at is Pakistan. Now, if you recall, Pakistan was established as the British Indian Empire was disbanded in 1947. Pakistan was established as a majority Muslim state, and it's not that big. Geographically, it's only about the size of Texas plus Louisiana. So geographically, it's not very big, but it's got a lot of people. 187, almost 100, almost 200 million, really, making it one of the world's 10 most populous states. So that's something that's relatively underappreciated. Because it is majority Muslim, and because it was established as a Muslim country, it's actually one of the most theocratic nations in the world. And that has only been exacerbated in recent times because of really economic challenges. As the book points out, Pakistan has had a recent economic boom, which is kind of common among South Asia. However, it's not filtered down to the poor. Literacy rates are not rising, health conditions are not improving significantly, national institutions are weak. Of the 180 million people, only about 2 million registered taxpayers pay taxes, so the government is relatively weak. And Pakistanis who used to be overwhelmingly secular in their political choices are now increasingly joining Islamic parties. So it seems that the political atmosphere is turning more toward theocracy in Pakistan. Even that being said, there are still internal divisions. Despite the fact that it is a Muslim nation, there are centrifugal forces at work as Sunni Muslims can't get along with Shiite Muslims. There's also other challenges involving the environment and concern about water supply in the future. Okay, the first two states of Pakistan that we're going to talk about are the two most significant. Between these two, the Punjab and the Sindh, notice that about 80% of the total population lives. In fact, just in the Punjab itself, there's about 100 million living in this particular region. So it is the cultural core and it's the population core of the country. Notice also we have the Indus River that flows through the Punjab, which meets up with the Sutlej, and then those both continue down into the Sindh. And this is actually a bone of contention. Again, Punjab kind of rules the roost. It's got the most population, and so the other states, the other parts of the country, sometimes feel underrepresented. They don't have enough say, and that has become an issue, especially with regard to water, because the flow of the Indus River is crucial to the agriculture in the Sindh. The Sindh is Pakistan's breadbasket. It's where a lot of the agriculture occurs, and yet up in the Punjab is where they're talking about doing damming for hydroelectric dams, which would affect the flow of water into the Sindh. So that is a bone of contention, and actually efforts have been put forward in the past for the Sindh to actually secede and become autonomous, which has not been successful. But just gives you an idea as to the level of mistrust of the main part of the country that some of the external parts of the country have. Okay, the remaining provinces of Pakistan are perhaps less important from a population or from an economic standpoint. From a political standpoint, are equally important. Notice Baluchistan. Where does it border? It borders Afghanistan and Iran. The tribal areas border Afghanistan. And these are the regions where, especially in the war on terror, there's very little control of these borders. And they're relatively porous, which allowed a lot of free flow of terrorists back and forth across the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It made it much more difficult to track down some of the leaders of some of these terrorist groups. As we mentioned before, in the Punjab, you have Lahore and some other major cities. That's considered to be the cultural and population center of Pakistan. But Karachi is actually the economic, the financial center, and also the most populous city. It's the biggest city, largely because it's their big port. It's their big outlet to the Arabian Sea. It's grown tremendously from about 100,000 at the beginning of the 20th century to about 500,000 in 1950 to 15.1 million today. So a huge amount of growth, and of course that leads to all the downsides of all that growth. A lot of disparity between rich and poor, a lot of crime, a lot of pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So what's in Pakistan's future? Well, it's sort of a mixed bag. It's too tough to tell. Pakistan has a lot of things going for it. It's a populous nation. It's one of the 10 most populous nations in the world. Therefore, it's going to be a major player. Of course, added into there is the fact that it does have nuclear weapons. So it's a player on the world stage. It cannot be forgotten about. It must not be overlooked. Where are the areas of hope? Well, certainly the fact that there has been a certain aspect of a green revolution in Pakistan. Agriculture is becoming more productive. There's more manufacturing going on. They've got textile mills, they've got steel mills. Where are the struggles? Well, certainly the fact that there's increased production of poppies, hashish, is going to further entangle the country in the illicit drug trade. But the biggest challenge is a religious aspect. The fact that the radical Islam means that Pakistan is a home for global terrorism. In fact, it's a home for some domestic terrorism. Your book details on page 432 the story of a former governor of Punjab who was assassinated in 2011 because he had spoken out against the country's pernicious blasphemy laws. Essentially, the fact that this is a theocratic state and there are Sharia laws that essentially take the teachings of Islam and map that out into civil society, forcing everyone, no matter what their religious beliefs, to live and abide by the teachings of the Quran. This former governor was considered to be in violation of that and was killed. So, so even domestic terror is a problem in Pakistan. Okay, so now we move on to India, called the giant of the realm, and for good reason. Geographically, it is large compared to the other countries in this South Asian region. Population-wise, it is giant compared to the other countries in this region. It's made up of 28 states, 6 unitary territories, and 1 national capital territory right there, essentially in the northern part of the country. And it is the world's largest functioning democracy. Now, how is it possible to keep a federation of states together as a single country when you're dealing with such a large landmass? Well, part of it is to the effort to, upon independence, to draw up state boundaries that help to reflect languages, religions, and cultural traditions. So it allows, that is kind of the spirit of democracy and inclusion and openness, and that has helped India keep things together over the last 70 years. As a detail, your book details the struggle, the challenge it is to, again, maintain unity among such disparate regions, in language, in religion, in cultural norms, in socioeconomic opportunities. And so India has tried to accommodate when possible. New states have been created when the need has arisen. And in recent times, the main challenge has been what's called the Naxalite threat. We mentioned that, again, India is a secular nation. It is a democratic nation. And yet among, especially the poor and disaffected populations, a Naxalite movement has kind of taken hold, especially in these regions that are kind of highlighted in red. And this is a communist, a Maoist-inspired type rebellion. And it is one of the goals of this Naxalite movement is to break up the stability of the nation. Of course, for India's continued economic progress and prospects, stability is key. So the Naxalite threat is a real one for the Indian government. One of the keys in keeping a very large country united as one federation is to recognize the centrifugal forces at play. Of course, as always, one of the centrifugal forces in any country, in any nation, is socioeconomic. And we'll talk about the caste system down the road here. But another thing is beliefs, particularly religious beliefs, and how religious beliefs then wind up having a force in politics. The fact that many people's religious beliefs make up their identity, and their identities then become part of the nation's politics. So let's just talk about some of the different belief systems in the country of India. One of the belief systems is called Sikhism. And Sikhism is sort of a combination. It was an attempt to merge the best ideas from the Hindu tradition and the Muslim tradition. And it has gained in popularity, and particularly in the Punjab, and particularly during the colonial period. The Sikh middle class was in alliance with the colonizers, and they still maintain a large influence. In fact, a perhaps oversized influence. Notice that they only make up 2% of the population, and yet they've got a much larger pull in government affairs than perhaps their actual population might merit. We can't overlook the fact that despite the fact that when the British Indian Empire was disbanded and Muslim countries of East Pakistan and West Pakistan were established, that didn't mean that all Muslims in the region moved to those countries. Many Muslims remained in India and continue to live in India. In fact, as your book mentions, when India became a sovereign state, the country was left with a Muslim minority of about 35 million, kind of widely dispersed. And now, the current Muslim population is estimated to exceed 200 million, so about 15% of the population. So therefore, India is home to the largest Muslim minority in the world. And of course, that means that Muslims need to be recognized in this democratic government. Just as we talked about various theocratic societies, we mainly talked about it with respect to Islam, the fact that we have what's called Sharia law, which is the attempt to establish as a rule for everyone the rules of a particular religion. So in Sharia law, you take the principles of Islam and you map that on the entire society so that everyone must follow. The civil laws are based in religious beliefs and tenets. The same idea is what's at play here with Hindutva, which is essentially the attempt to make India a society in which Hindu principles prevail. And this really goes against the whole tenet of India's democratic government. India is very much like America in that it is a secular nation. That means that there is no state-sanctioned religion. You're free to practice any religion, but as far as the state sanctioning any particular one religion in preference to others, that just can't happen. And that's what Hindutva, why it's so worrisome. As your book mentions, it concerns those who understand that India's secularism, its separation of religion and state, is indispensable to the survival of democracy. Seen from outside the Hindu tradition, seen from a Westerner's perspective, one of the biggest civil liberties issues or civil rights issues in India is this persistence of caste. And the caste system is essentially a system of social stratification that some people, depending upon who their family was or where they were born, what part of the country. All this sort of predetermines how far you can succeed in life. And all this really got its start in Hinduism. One of the tenets of Hinduism is reincarnation, the fact that it is thought that you'll live a future life, and your status in that future life depends upon your status in this life and in past lives. And so that's how essentially the caste system got started. So it's got its basis in the Hindu religion. And now in modern day India, which is again secular, where it's not pushed one particular tenet, obviously the caste system is not it doesn't help in making India a stronger economic power, but this system has persisted, particularly in rural areas, not so much in the urban areas, but certainly in the rural areas. The caste system continues, and it does limit the freedom and the opportunity of the citizens. So what has the government done to get rid of the caste system? What kind of pressures has the government been able to apply? Well, certainly quotas has been essentially an affirmative action system where the groups that have traditionally not had opportunities, that were not allowed to work in professions outside of socially specified occupations, there have been quotas set up for those groups. Similarly with school admission, with government jobs, etc., members of the legislature, there are now quotas that have been established to make some of these disenfranchised groups now part of the mainstream. Typically, India is sort of divided into kind of a north and south region, where the north is more progressive, the south is kind of backward. But this section actually mentions that if you divide India essentially in a line here between Lucknow and Chennai, and divide an eastern section and a western section, that's another good way of kind of looking at India's current economy and its economic future, where the eastern part of the country still has most of its economy based in industrial, in fact, relatively outdated industrial economy, whereas the western part of the nation is a little more forward-looking, and a lot of the development is along the lines of IT. You've got all these different cities that have cropped up that are essentially information technology is where a lot of its commerce comes from. Now, of course, the IT, despite how profitable it is and what a driver it has been for the Indian economy, that's relatively limited as far as the number of jobs that it provides. It provides jobs to the most educated, sort of the elite in the cities, which means that still a large part of the Indian population has no relation at all, sees no benefit from the IT economy. A lot of folks are still farmers and many times subsistence farmers. Despite its IT growth and all this outsourcing that has occurred, a lot of foreign companies are using Indian labor to do a lot of the information technology work. But what India needs far more in terms of employment growth are manufacturing industries competitively selling goods on the world markets. And that would put tens of millions to work and transform the economy. Clearly, India is very different from China. The two may have comparably sized populations, but the Chinese economy employs 12 times as many workers in manufacturing and has a much larger urban middle class. So China has been able to build factories that produce products that the world wants and is willing to trade for. And that's what India needs to do more of. India, on the other hand, has shown spectacular growth, but too much of it is confined to the IT market. And that only benefits a small, highly educated urban elite. Again, it's a very large urban center, almost 21 million people, 8 million slum dwellers. And if you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire a few years ago, it talks about life in the slums of Mumbai, because of course Mumbai is also home to Bollywood. Um, One thing that's very interesting to mention is the fact that you have in India an informal economy that goes on. Essentially, a lot of merchants, a lot of mom and pop merchants who are unregistered, they don't pay taxes. And now a move as the middle class in India expands, a move toward shopping malls and such. And what effect will that have um, on these small mom and pop uh, informal retailers? This is a city that seems to have its best days behind it. Of course, there's always hope, but this city was the capital of the British colonial empire. But in the 20th century, things have not been quite as good as after the British Empire was dismantled. The nation's capital was moved to New Delhi, and Kolkata has been sort of left behind in modernization. Again, it's more of an industrial center and not a force in the progressive IT economy. As has been mentioned in the previous modules, especially when you have a colonial presence, quite often the infrastructure, the roads, the highways that were built were essentially built to take resources from the inner part of the country to the coast in order for those resources to then be shipped somewhere else. So there's never been a lot of, or one problem that there has been, or one hurdle to developing a country post-independence has always been internal connections. The fact that you don't have a whole lot of roads, infrastructure built from city to city. And so that's one of the efforts that India is doing, is to set up a superhighway linking some of these important cities. Some of the problems, of course, are the fact that there's a lot of checkpoints and tolls, making interstate commerce very difficult. That's one of the beauties of the U.S. interstate highway system, is that you can take goods and services from one state to another with almost no problem. You're not stopped at the border from one state to another and forced to pay a toll, or forced to go through paperwork and corruption and all that kind of stuff. Another infrastructure challenge for modern day India is electricity. Just as I mentioned, there was an insufficient network of roadways between major population sites. Similarly, railways are insufficient, especially between cities, between population centers, and that is seen in the problem as far as providing electricity to the nation. The fact that, of course, electricity comes from some form of energy. It can be either fossil fuel burning, hydroelectric plants, nuclear plants. For India, the most logical solution would be coal, because they've got a large coal supply. The problem being that their existing railroad system is not able to get the coal from the coal producing regions to potential or existing energy electricity plants. So what is India to do? Well, they have to import. They have to import oil and gas, again, to burn, to heat water, to spin turbines, to create electricity. And of course, that raises geopolitical issues, either because you have to build pipelines across countries, or you have to import from players like Iran, and that falls out of favor with the United States and other world powers. So this is an issue, of course, to provide a reliable energy supply or electricity supply to a nation that is, a lot of its development is related to information technology. So you need to have electricity to run those businesses. Of course, this is all goes without saying, the fact that India is not that urbanized. There's still a lot of rural people who don't even have access to electricity. So as is mentioned, the fact that India has such a large population means that it has a large potential market where you could sell to that large population. The importance is that, of course, you need them to be able to afford to buy your products. So how can India become expand its middle class? That's really the important thing, because it seems to have leapfrogged. It went from it being underdeveloped to essentially an information-based economy. It's now, a lot of IT work is done in India, and there's still a missing manufacturing base that, again, China seems to currently be the leader in. So the question is, how can you expand manufacturing in order to provide more jobs to more middle-class people? Okay, so now we move on to Bangladesh. Bangladesh, of course, had been East Pakistan following the partition of British Indian Empire. And just like Pakistan, the population density of Bangladesh is pretty high, because it's 158.1 million in a territory the size of Wisconsin. Now, a lot of these are subsistence farmers. So economically, Bangladesh is not thriving. Another issue for Bangladesh is, of course, it seems like there's always a natural disaster going on. They're prone to earthquakes. They're prone to flooding, either because quite often due to cyclones that move up the Bay of Bengal and inundate the coastal regions with storm surge, as well as the rainfall from tropical systems can cause the Ganges and the Jamuna River in this delta region to become flooded. So in recent years, it's been, notice 8 out of the 10 world's deadliest natural disasters have struck here. Okay, so the challenges for Bangladesh are many. Among them is the high demographic burden, the fact that it's got a large population. The birth rates are still relatively high. And again, population itself is not the real problem. It's the fact that you've got a population that is largely subsistence farmers, and the productivity per individual is not that great. You can have a large population, and as long as you've got a high productivity, you can have a successful economy. But when you've got a high population and a low productivity, that's going to cause the nation to be mired in a third world status. Okay, I strongly encourage you to watch this video. This is about Bangladesh and the fact that it is a river delta. It's a low-lying area. And this whole region is agriculturally very productive, and that's the reason why you have a lot of people living there, and they're essentially being subsistence farmers in this region. But the fact that this area is also very prone to sea level rise. Quite often we talk about global warming, and sea level rise is rather abstract concepts, and we don't think about the human impact that sea level rise can have. And I encourage you to watch this video to really get a feel for what sea level rise does to people's lives, and the ramifications that future additional sea level rise will have for countries like Bangladesh. Bangladesh is an overwhelmingly Muslim society, but in some ways it has been a very progressive one, particularly when it comes to the role of women. For example, 30 seats in the national legislature are reserved for women. Much of this success is attributed to the role of non-governmental organizations that, independently of but supported by the national government, have promoted programs to improve the quality of life. An important example concerns family planning programs, in which women play the lead role. They've got free contraceptives and education, and the fertility rate has dropped dramatically. That is going to be one of the keys to the success for many of these South Asian nations, is empowering women to make choices about their own reproductive rights. Once you do that, the boon to the economy is quickly felt. It's known as the city of mosques and muslin. Muslin is a type of cotton, and the city of mosques is a tip of the hat to the fact that the population is 90% Muslim. Now, one of the problems for Dhaka is the fact that it is near sea level. It's in the delta region, and therefore it is prone to flooding, prone to flooding from cyclones, as well as eventually could be prone to additional sea level rise. But the book mentions that in 1970, a cyclone killed as many as 500,000 people, destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, and it flooded most of the city of Dhaka. Okay, so now we move on to Nepal. Now notice Nepal is located as a buffer state between India and China, the two big powers in this region. Now, Nepal is majority Hindu, and it's actually a Hindu state. It is home to Mount Everest. There's Mount Everest right there on the border between Nepal and China. Its neighbor, Bhutan, is another buffer state between India and China. Bhutan, on the other hand, is a Buddhist state, and it's relatively isolated. It's essentially inaccessible, isolated, and therefore traditional ways of life prevail, but this is not an economic power by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so out in the Indian Ocean are the Maldives, and the Maldives are essentially 1,000 small islands that, for the most part, exist as a tourist playground. So most of the industry is serving tourists from Europe and other locations. The problem with that kind of an economy, despite the fact that it allows for a large gross national income, notice that all that foreign tourist spending allows a fairly high income for the residents of the Maldives. The problem is that it is vulnerable to economic downturns when the world economy starts to decline and people don't have disposable income to take vacations, then the Maldives would be hit significantly. Similarly, Maldives is frequently mentioned in terms of global warming because most of the island is highest elevation of about 2 meters. So additional sea level rise in the Indian Ocean will essentially swamp the Maldives. Okay, and finally Sri Lanka. Now Sri Lanka is an island nation to the southeast of the South Indian Peninsula. And what's really interesting is that at one time, Sri Lanka was connected via a land bridge to the mainland of India. This land bridge was called Rama's Bridge. Now it's submerged. It's called the Palk Strait. But this allowed people to migrate from mainland India to Sri Lanka. And the first people who populated Sri Lanka about 2,500 years ago were the Sinhalese. And they brought with them their Buddhist tradition. And then, years later, when the British colonized South Asia, they set up plantations on Sri Lanka, and they imported Tamils to work the plantations. The Tamils are Hindus, and so you have kind of a conflict, a religious conflict, a cultural conflict between these two groups, which has erupted in recent decades. So Sri Lanka has a lot of things going for it, but it has also essentially had a separatist eastern and northern section where the Tamils and the Tamil Tigers have essentially tried to set up their own nation. And here's another video that I strongly encourage you to check out. This is from Jaffna, which is a city in far northern Sri Lanka. It's in that disputed area where the Tamils are essentially wanting independence for that region. And the city has been plagued by war for the past 20 years. The war has created a lot of tension among the people. So the military does normal patrols around the city to assure their safety. And this video provides a glimpse of everyday life in Jaffna and how its people react to the violence around them. Compare maps of Pakistan's population distribution and Pakistan's subregions. From the population map, what two features seem to determine population distribution patterns? And how does Pakistan's population distribution impact the allocation of political power among its subregions and the government's ability to effectively govern? Another thing to think about, what about the geography of Bangladesh makes them vulnerable to flooding? How might this worsen for the people of Bangladesh if climate change raises sea levels and warms ocean temperatures, and precipitation intensifies from stronger tropical cyclones and monsoons? How are the Maldives especially vulnerable to climate change? And finally, discuss how Nepal and Bhutan share similarities but are very different from each other too.